The excavator's bucket hit something that wasn't rock and wasn't root. Wyatt Cole heard the sound before he understood it, a deep, resonant thunk, like a fist on a door that had been closed for 100 years. He killed the engine. Marsh water crept back into the trench he'd cut, brown and patient, erasing his work as fast as he made it. He climbed down into the mud anyway, because something dark was showing through the black water where the bucket had struck. Wood, not a root, not a stump. A squared edge cut clean by a saw that hadn't touched a tree in this county for generations. He knelt in the muck, in water up to his forearms, and ran his palm along the grain. Tight rings, dense as stone, wood that had no business surviving underground this long, and yet here it was, dark as coffee, and hard as the day it was felled. Wyatt had 11 days left on the loan notice pinned under a coffee cup on his kitchen table. 11 days before the bank took the marsh, the pasture, and the house his grandfather built with his own hands. He had no idea, kneeling in that black water, that what he'd just found was worth more than everything the bank was about to take from him combined. He also had no idea why it was buried there in the first place, or that the answer to that question would change how he understood his own family for good. Wyatt Cole was 44 years old, and up until 3 weeks ago, he'd never once looked at the marsh on the back 40 as anything but a problem. 60 acres of standing water, cattails, and mosquitoes that swallowed a third of his family's land and had swallowed over the decades. 2 tractors, a fair amount of his father's patience, and most of his grandfather's stories about what used to be down there. His grandfather, Earl Cole, had died when Wyatt was 19, and the only thing Wyatt remembered clearly about the marsh was Earl standing at its edge some evenings, not fishing, not working, just looking at it like it owed him something. Wyatt hadn't thought about that in 25 years. He thought about it now because the bank's notice said the land, Marsh included, would be seized for auction if he didn't produce $41,000 by the end of the month. And a man from an agricultural surveying company had told him, almost as an afterthought, that Drain Marsh could sometimes be reclassified and sold for more than wetland. That was the whole plan. Drain a section, prove it could be farmland, get the county to reassess the value, use that to renegotiate with the bank. A long shot, but Wyatt didn't have a short one. He'd been an equipment mechanic for 18 years before the shop closed, which meant he knew how to run a rented excavator badly but not dangerously, and he had exactly one friend willing to help him try. Dale Pruitt, who farmed the property next door and had known Wyatt since grade school. Dale showed up on day 2 after the first log surfaced and stood at the edge of the trench with his hands on his hips. "You're not going to drain 60 acres with a rented Kubota, Wyatt." "Wasn't planning to drain all 60, just the east corner, enough to show the county it's not permanent wetland." Dale looked at the black timber lying half exposed in the mud, water sheeting off it. "That's an old log." "No kidding. I mean old. Look at that grain." Dale crouched, the way a man does when he already half suspects an answer he doesn't want to say out loud. "My granddad used to talk about logs down in this marsh. Said there was a story about it. I always figured it was drunk uncle talk." Wyatt felt something shift in his chest. Not hope exactly, just the first crack in a wall he hadn't known was there. "What kind of story?" "Don't remember. Something about your great-granddad and a lawsuit." "I was a kid." Dale straightened up, and something crossed his face that Wyatt would only understand the meaning of much later. "You ought to leave it alone, honestly. Digging around in a marsh with a rented machine on a deadline, with a bank breathing on you. That's how men lose fingers, or worse." It was reasonable advice. Wyatt didn't take it. By the end of the first week, he'd uncovered 4 more logs, all in a rough line beneath 8 feet of muck, all cut with the same era of saw, all impossibly dense and dark, from decades submerged in oxygen-starved water. He called a timber buyer 2 counties over. a man named Rusty. Vance, who dealt in salvage lumber, mostly reclaimed barnwood, and river-recovered logs from old log drive operations. Rusty drove out on a Thursday, took one look at the exposed section of the third log, and went quiet in a way that made Wyatt nervous. "You know what this is?" Rusty finally asked. "Old timber. This is heart pine, old growth, and it's what we call a sinker, a log that went under during a drive or a flood and got buried before it could rot. Cold, low-oxygen water like this, it can preserve wood for 100 years, sometimes longer. The tree that made this log was probably 200-300 years old when it was cut. You cannot buy trees like that anymore. They don't exist standing anywhere in this state. So it's worth something." Rusty looked at him like he'd asked whether water was wet. "Sinker heart pine this size, this age, this preserved, flooring companies pay premium for it. Furniture makers pay more. But the real money's guitar and piano builders. Tight. Even growth rings like this, they call it tonewood quality. A single clean 12-foot section could run you $8,000–$10,000, depending on how it mills out. You've got 5 logs down there, maybe more." Wyatt did the math badly and did it again, and it still came out bigger than the number on his loan notice. "How'd it get down there?" he asked. "Why would anybody bury logs worth that kind of money and just leave them?" Rusty shrugged. "Happens more than you'd think. Log drives 100 years back. They'd float thousands of logs downriver to the mill. Some sank. Companies wrote them off. Not worth the cost of recovery at the time. Nobody buries treasure on purpose, Wyatt. Usually it's just an accident nobody bothered to fix." That explanation sat wrong with Wyatt from the moment he heard it, though he couldn't have said why. Log drives happened on rivers. This was a marsh, still water, landlocked with no current strong enough to carry a felled tree anywhere. If these logs had sunk during a drive, they'd have sunk in a river a mile east, not here. Somebody had put them here, on purpose, and buried them deep enough that nobody found them again, for the better part of a century. The complication arrived 4 days later in the form of a certified letter and Dale Pruitt standing in Wyatt's driveway, looking like a man who badly didn't want to be having the conversation he was about to have. "County's saying the marsh sits partly on an old boundary dispute," Dale said. "Goes back to my family and yours. There's a survey question about where the line actually falls. My grandfather's estate lawyer found some paperwork when we were settling my dad's affairs last year. I wasn't going to bring it up. Didn't seem worth it over a swamp nobody wanted. But if you're pulling valuable timber out of there, it's worth it now." Wyatt read the letter twice. The Pruitts were formally requesting a boundary survey before any further extraction activity on the disputed acreage, which happened to be the exact 8 acres where the logs sat buried. "You knew about this," Wyatt said. "The whole time you've been out here helping me dig. I didn't know there was anything worth arguing over until Rusty Vance started talking numbers in the feed store on Tuesday. Word travels fast in a town this size, Wyatt. You know that." Dale had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I'm not trying to steal your marsh, but if that timber's really worth what they're saying, and if even a strip of it sits on Pruitt land, my family's got a legal claim. I didn't write the deed history. I just found it." It wasn't a betrayal, not really. Wyatt understood that even in the moment, angry as he was. Dale was a man protecting his own family's stake the same way Wyatt was protecting his. That was the trouble with the whole situation. Nobody in it was a villain. Everybody just wanted to keep what little ground they had left. But it meant Wyatt now had 11 days shrinking towards 6, a survey he couldn't afford, a boundary dispute a century old, and timber he legally couldn't touch until it was resolved. He went to the courthouse the next morning looking for the original deed, hoping to settle the line once and for all. What he found instead was his great-grandfather's name, Silas Cole, attached to a 1931 civil suit, Cole versus Ashford Lumber Company, and a judgment that had been sealed from public record for reasons the clerk couldn't explain, and Wyatt couldn't afford the fee to unseal. Ashford Lumber. He'd never heard the name in his life. But it was the first real thread, and he pulled it. The County Historical Society kept a room of donated ledgers nobody had digitized, and an elderly volunteer named Miss Pearl who remembered vaguely that Ashford Lumber had once owned most of the timber rights along the Eastern Creek before going bankrupt sometime around the Depression. It took Wyatt an entire afternoon of squinting at brittle paper to piece together what had happened. Ashford Lumber had held a contract to log Silas Cole's virgin timber stand, hundreds of acres of old-growth pine, some of the last untouched heart pine forest left in the region even then, under an agreement that paid Silas a fixed sum regardless of how much wood the company actually took. Silas had signed that contract as a young man, desperate for cash without understanding what he was giving away. By the time he realized Ashford intended to strip the entire stand and pay him a fraction of its true worth, the company had already cut most of it. But not all of it. The ledger held a single line, half-smudged, that stopped Wyatt Cole. S. Cole refuses delivery of final harvest. Claims breach. Disputes company right to remaining stand pending court review. Silas had sued to stop the last cutting. The finest, oldest trees on the property, the ones deepest in the stand and hardest to reach. And while the lawsuit dragged through the courts, he'd done something the record didn't explain outright. But that Wyatt, standing in that quiet room with mud still under his fingernails, suddenly understood completely. He hadn't left those last trees standing to be seized the moment the lawsuit failed. He'd cut them himself, quietly, before Ashford's crews could, and buried them. Wyatt drove home faster than the roads deserved and stood at the edge of the marsh as the sun went down, looking at it the way his grandfather used to. Not as a swamp, as a vault. It fit once he saw it. The marsh wasn't natural, or not entirely. There was an old earthen berm along the creek's original path that Wyatt had always assumed was just a drainage ridge. It was a dam. Silas hadn't buried logs in a marsh. He'd built the marsh, damming a shallow creek bend deep enough to submerge his own harvest before Ashford's lawyers or crews could reach it, betting that cold, oxygen-starved water would hold the wood safe until the lawsuit resolved in his favor and he could legally reclaim it. The lawsuit never resolved. The judgment was sealed. Wyatt would learn later, digging further, that Ashford had gone under during the Depression before the case ever reached a verdict, and with no company left to sue and no money for lawyers, the case simply died on the docket. Silas never got his ruling. He never drained the marsh. He grew old telling his son and later his grandson Earl vague half-stories about what used to be down there, and died without ever finding the money or the proof to go back and dig up what was rightfully his. Earl had stood at the edge of that marsh his whole life, looking at it like it owed him something because it did. He just never had the means, or maybe the nerve, to go looking. Wyatt did. The boundary dispute resolved faster than anyone expected once Wyatt brought the sealed 1931 case file to a lawyer in the county seat, who found what the original judge would have found had the case ever concluded. The disputed line had always run in the Coles' favor. Ashford's claim to the final stand had been contested and never legally settled in the company's favor, which meant Silas Cole's ownership of that timber, cut, buried, or standing, had never actually lapsed. Dale's family had a legitimate boundary question about 2 acres to the north. The marsh and everything under it was Cole land, and had been for 94 years, whether anyone alive remembered it or not. Dale took the news better than Wyatt expected. "Good," he said, standing at the edge of the trench a week later, watching a second excavator, a real one, hired, not rented, lift a 14-foot log free of the mud with a sound like the earth exhaling. I didn't want it anyway. Just didn't want to get run over pretending I didn't notice. They found 11 logs in total before the season turned too cold to keep working the water. Rusty Vance came back with 2 buyers. This time, one from a flooring company out of Nashville, one a soft-spoken man who built high-end acoustic guitars in a shop outside Asheville, and examined the grain of the smallest log for almost 20 minutes without saying a word. The final number, once everything was milled, graded, and sold, came to just under $110,000. Not a fortune. Not the kind of number that changes a man into someone else. But it was more than triple what the marshland itself would have fetched at auction, drained or not, and it was enough, more than enough, to clear the loan, keep the house, and put something back for the first time in years, instead of just falling further behind. Wyatt paid off the bank with 3 days left on the notice. He kept 8 feet of one log, the smallest, roughest one, and the first that ever came up, uncut, and set it on a concrete pad near the porch, where his grandfather used to stand looking at the water. He didn't drain the rest of the marsh. He'd thought about it in the early days when it was still just a wet, useless stretch of land standing between him and solvency. Now he let it be what it had always secretly been. Not a problem on the property, but the reason the property had survived at all. Some evenings he still walks down to the edge of it, the way Earl used to, and looks at the black water sitting quiet over whatever else might still be down there. He doesn't know if there's more. He isn't in a hurry to find out. What he knows now is that his great-grandfather didn't bury a bad investment or forget about worthless scrapwood in a swamp nobody wanted. He hid the one thing a desperate man could still protect from people trying to take everything else, and trusted, without any proof it would work, that someday somebody in his family would understand what the Marsh had been holding on to the whole time. It took 94 years. But somebody finally did.